Hello, everybody. We are on to the next section of Unit 4 learning. And here we're going to be talking about the schedules of reinforcement. Okay, so write that at the top. And so this is basically how do we remember what we talked about reinforcement. Reinforcement is to increase a behavior. So the schedules of reinforcement is to do exactly that, right? How do we schedule to make sure that the behavior is going to increase? Okay, so this is a systematic way of doing this. Now, we're going to start with the first subtopic, and that is reinforcement schedule. And reinforcement schedule is, simply put, is a pattern that defines how often a desired response will be enforced. Okay, so it's basically just a pattern to determine, or a pattern that is set to see how often a desired response will be reinforced. So basically, the behavior. How often do I want to reinforce the behavior? Okay, and every time, is it every time they do the behavior, or is it every other time? Okay, and so basically here, what you need to know about reinforcement schedule is that it can vary. Okay, it doesn't have to be all the time, it could be sometimes. So we're gonna go a little bit more into that. Okay, so there's kind of two types of reinforcement. Either we're going to do this continuous reinforcement, or we're going to go into the intermittent. Okay, and it's exactly what it means, right? You break, guys, the best thing to do here is break down words so that it just makes sense. Okay, so continuous reinforcement is basically you're going to reinforce the desired behavior every time it happens. Okay, so continuous reinforcement is every time the behavior is done, you're going to reinforce it, right? Give it something so that the behavior increases. Okay, so when you do continuous reinforcement, you got to know the pros and cons of using both. The pros for continuous reinforcement is that the learning happens very quickly, okay? So for instance, when I used to work with my kids with special ed that had a lot of behavior problems, we used a lot of these schedules of reinforcement and a variety, different types. So the first one, especially if I want to teach them the behavior that I want to be increased, I had to use continuous reinforcement. So let's say I had a kid that didn't sit down, right? It was like, or didn't, yeah, let's say he didn't sit down. He liked to get up, walked around, caused problems. Okay, so every time that that kid would sit down, the student would sit down, I would reinforce it with, I had to learn also what was desirable for that student. So a lot of them, obviously, food was a great reinforcer. So I would use like candy, right? Or stickers. Some students really like stickers, some like the attention. So it was kind of like literally every time they did something, I would give them the points. We also had like a point system. So they had like points, and every time they did it, I would be, here's a point, right? Now, obviously, they picked up very quickly that, hey, every time I do this, I'm going to get points. And those points, they would use it to buy stuff, okay? So this is a great choice if I need to teach a behavior right now, right? Like soon I need the behavior to be picked up, right? So obviously, as a teacher, having a student sit down is very important, right? So that's definitely behavior that you want to continuously enforce. The problem with continuous reinforcement is it has a higher probability of extinction happening sooner. Okay, so extinction happens sooner with continuous because basically, if they're constantly dependent on the continuous reinforcement, the minute you take away that reinforcement when they're doing the behavior, they're just gonna stop. They're gonna be like, well, where's my reward? So then they stop doing it. So extinction is typically it happens a lot faster. Also, it's really hard to do continuously, right? So you can't be doing this all the time. So for example, candy machines, right? Like those little vending machines, when you put in the money, you know that you're gonna get your candy back. So what are you gonna do? You're gonna continue doing that, right? The minute that you go to a vending machine and it stops working, you tend not to go back again, right? Okay. Now, obviously, it's very difficult to do a continuous reinforcement for a long, long period of time. Okay, so that's another thing you need to know. So you could add that example, right? Continuous reinforcement or giving a sticker every time they do something. Like for you guys, when I first started teaching, when you guys first came into my class, I checked your homework every single class, right? But it's always not realistic, because I wanted to reinforce the behavior of doing your homework. And so now it's kind of an intermittent schedule now. See, now you guys need to know my little secrets. All right, the next one is intermittent reinforcement. Sometimes it could be it could be called partial reinforcement. See, I have to entertain you somehow. Anyway, intermittent is exactly what it means, that you're only reinforcing the behavior part of the time. So, for instance, I hope you wrote that down. For instance, if I had that student that I wanted to reinforce sitting, at the beginning, I would definitely use continuous reinforcement. And over time, it's kind of like once in a while, right? I would give points or I would give them a candy. And so this is really good for a long-term behavior to sustain itself, okay? The problem with that is, so make sure you write that. So it takes a long time to learn the appropriate behavior, because if they're not sure what behavior, if you don't pinpoint it at the beginning, it's a little difficult, right? That's why it's good to mix continuous with intermittent. Another example is what I just said before, right? At the beginning of when I first got you guys, I would check your homework a lot, and then now it's kind of intermittent so that you don't really know, so that I could sustain that behavior of doing your homework, okay? Another thing with intermittent is that extinction happens less. It's less likely for extinction to happen, okay? The problem with this is it's not predictable. You can't really guarantee that the behavior is going to be mastered, all right? So a good example is slot machines, right? You don't know when you're going to win, so you're going to tend to do it more. So this is a good thing about intermittent reinforcement. All right. So then with that being said, we're going to go into the types of schedules, okay? So there are technically 4 types of schedule, and I want you guys to do this, okay, with me exactly. Please have your notes how I'm doing them here in so you guys can see, because it does get confusing with ratio, interval, schedule, and all these words in between. But if you break it down, it becomes a lot easier, okay? So I want you to write down the types of schedules. And the first one I want you to write down is ratio schedule, okay? So ratio schedule is basically, ratio has to do with number, okay? And I'll write this down. So this is the number of behaviors required. Okay, so it could be like you're going to raise your hand 5 times and then I'll give you a candy. Okay, so this reinforcement here is based on the number of behaviors required. Okay, it's a set number. Well, it's not set. Interval has to do with reinforcement is due to the time. Okay, so the passage of time. So let's say an example is, after 5 minutes of doing this, I'm going to give you a sticker, okay, or after an hour, or after 10 days, all right? The next one is going to be variable. So what I want you to focus on is every time you see these words, this is what it means. So ratio is the number of behaviors I need to see. And then interval has to do with time of day. Keep that in mind, okay? Variable is what it means is that the reinforcement is going to vary, okay? So this is kind of like that intermittent reinforcement, okay? And let's say if I use variable reinforcement, that means you don't know when you're going to get the reinforcer, okay? And then the other one is going to be fixed reinforcement, which just basically means a set number, like, you know, if I tell you for every 5 days you're going to get a reward, okay? It's a set time, like, you know what to expect, okay? So this is, I wouldn't say it's continuous, because, well, it could be a little bit of continuous because you know, right? Continuous is more like I'm doing it every time the behavior happens. Okay, this doesn't always fit that. Okay, so what you guys are going to be seeing is sometimes you'll see it just like this, broken up, like ratio, schedule, interval. But we're gonna practice a lot what is the schedules of reinforcement, because now we're gonna combine the 4 different like methods. They're going to get combined, okay? Because when you want to reinforce a behavior, you want a behavior to be increased, you want to make sure that you're going to use different schedules for depending on the behavior. Now, this is actually what a lot of people are studying now, ABA, which is I think it's, well, I don't want to butcher it right now, but I'll tell you in class, okay? Or we will Google that. Right now, I can't do that. But anyway, the ABA is basically the doing exactly like this, trying to reinforce behaviors, okay, as well as decrease other behaviors. But that would be punishment, okay? So let's start with the first one, which is fixed ratio. Please, guys, do this how I'm teaching you so it's easier for you to figure out what the words mean, okay? So fix means set. So you're just gonna put set ratio, and ratio has to do with the number of behaviors. So for this one, you're going to, and now write this down under there, your fixed ratio is when you have a set number of behaviors, okay? So for example, this would be for every 5 hand raise, you get a sticker or candy. Gives you a candy. Like, you know, you can anticipate, you know how many behaviors that you need to do in order to get the reward, okay? This one is a good thing. This is like this is a positive in the sense, especially when you want to get, and you're gonna need to write this down because you need to know which one to use. This is good when you are starting off a behavior you want the person to learn or you want to increase. Okay, so this is good to entry level when you're trying to really reinforce behaviors. Okay, it's clear. This one is another example of this is, you know, those little punch cards when you go, let's say, to I don't know, the ice cream places, or even like the apps like Starbucks. Every time you go eat something, they give you points, right? And then eventually those points allow you to buy stuff for free, okay? So that's fixed ratio. Now, the next one is going to be variable ratio, which just basically means variable means vary, and then ratio means number of behaviors. So basically, you don't know, and you're gonna write this down, you don't know when you're going to be in reinforce with how, like, you're not going to know how many times you have to do the behavior in order to get reinforced, okay? So for example, if I'm doing the hand raise, I may reinforce you after 6 hand raise. I may reinforce you after 20, maybe after 2. So it's going to vary how many times you have to do the behavior. This one is very, very effective for continuous behaviors, like for the behavior to continue over a long time, because they're constantly trying to seek that reward, right? Or that reinforcer. A great example of this is slot machines, right? Gamblers. This is why people gamble, because you have to keep on doing the behavior and eventually you'll get a reward. Fishing is another variable ratio, okay? Let's go to the next one, which is fixed interval. So now we're going to talk about time. So fixed is a set time to get reward, okay, or reinforcer. So for example, if I tell you, okay, at 9 a.m., this is when you're going to get your reward, okay? so when I worked with my students in that school, we used to have a point system. But we would have 10 desirable behaviors that we wanted them to do. And then every 30 minutes, we had to check in on their behavior, like every 30 minutes. So those kids knew at 9:55, they knew that they were going to get checked in their behavior. So what do you think happens when you get closer to that time? Right? They're going to increase the behavior they want. So a lot of them would behave super bad the first 20 minutes. And then right those 5 minutes right before the time, they were like, oh, I'm behaving super good, right? And they're like, oh, but miss, I'm doing good. I'm like, yeah, I didn't forget those last 20 minutes you were not doing what you needed to do, right? So this one is good because the behavior tends to happen more during the time. Another perfect example of this fixed interval is right before the bell rings at like 9:03. You guys love to start packing up, right? And then everybody starts doing it. Everybody starts packing up because you're getting closer to the time that you know you're going to exit. So they're reinforcing that behavior. Now, um, another good example is if you are checking your text messages because you know, let's say that somebody always texts you, like, or your best friends always text you right when they get out of school at 2:30, you already start checking your phone because you know they're gonna start texting. Okay, so that's another example. The next one is going to be variable interval schedule. So this one is just that the it's varied time to get reinforcer. All right. So for this one, you don't know when you're going to get reinforced. So this is another good example of this is when I check your homework. Okay. You don't know if I'm going to check it, if I am. All right. This is good because you don't know when you're going to get the reinforcer. So over time, it's a good thing to get the behaviors to continue, right? So over time, but not at the beginning. But what ends up happening, like what's happening to some of you guys, is that you're like, well, she's not checking all the time, so let me stop doing it. And then when that happens, then I have to kick in the the fixed ratio, right? In which, or actually, it's a fixed interval. Every time you come into the class, I check your homework. Okay, so I do need to talk a little bit about shaping. So I hope that helps. We definitely will do a lot of practice. I just kind of need you guys to get the main words. So when you see it, you could break it up. Okay, because we're gonna be doing like breaking up the words in class and then doing a lot of examples. Okay. All right, so shaping behavior. What exactly is shaping behavior? And this is when it's a procedure, right? Like everything, in which we are going to reinforce the guided behavior towards, and I hope you're writing this down, closer and closer proximity of the desired behavior. Okay, I'll say it again. So this is a procedure in which the reinforcers, okay, are going to guide the behavior step by step so it's closer to the desired behavior. Okay, so basically what they're going to do is they're going to do like baby steps. Okay, the best way to think of it, if let's say I want to teach a child to tie their shoes, okay, and this is actually a procedure when I was in college that my professor would use for his students that were learning how to tie their shoes. Okay, so you obviously can't give a child that, let's say, has behavior problems or developmental problems, like, okay, here's a shoe, tie it. It's a lot of steps, it's difficult. And so what he did is that he would use shaping. And so he couldn't give the kid the shoe and just tie it. So what he did is he would put like 5 shoes out with shoelaces, and then he would teach them the first step into tying your shoes. Okay, so then they'll do the first step, and then for all the shoes, just do the first step and first step until they have mastered, right, that behavior. Then, once they've mastered that behavior, you go on to the next step, right? And then the next step is, get the 2 little bunny ears, Okay, and then practice that. Two bunny ears, practice, practice, practice until they mastered. And then it's kind of like that next step to learning. Okay. So for instance, with some of my students that were misbehaving and had a difficult time with sitting, so I would do like little, like kind of like baby steps. Okay, like we're gonna sit here in this chair for maybe like 2 minutes. Okay, and then slowly kind of work your way up to a little bit more, maybe a different setting, right? Some students had a hard time just sitting in a class, so they had to kind of sit. We had like different sitting areas, so sometimes they had to just sit over there and then slowly work your way into the classroom. Okay, so sometimes it's called chaining, right? It's like chaining the behavior. Um, and that's when we kind of combine it. So like they do that with the tying of the shoes, right? Once you've learned a couple steps, put them together, right? And then you're continuously building on that skill. Okay. And that is it for this section. I will see you guys in class. Have a wonderful day. And that's it.